everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about socioeconomic and sustainable development. And my name is Shreya Barkata. It's nice to meet you all. So this is our weekly stream calendar. On Mondays, we do our streams for math and English. On Tuesdays, we do our streams for social science, which includes AP Human Geography at 7 p.m. And then on Wednesdays, we do our science streams, and on Thursday, we do our history streams. So make sure you let all your friends know, because all of our videos and like live streams, replays, they're all free now, including like study guides, study plans, and trivia. And we're also doing our Cram sessions. So if you bought a Cram pass, you should be attending the Cram sessions that Amanda is doing, because they're really helpful and they'll help you like prepare for the AP exam, especially because of all the updates that's been made. And these are some of the upcoming live reviews for AP Hug. So on April 21st, Rita will be doing a stream on population and migration. And then right after that at 8 p.m., Amanda will be doing the third Cram session about Unit 3, and that's a great review of Unit 3. And then Sylvan Levin will be doing a Q&A study session at 12 p.m. on April 23rd. So if you have any questions about the exam, any content questions, that's the place to go. And then Harrison will be doing a stream on the Industrial Revolution at 2 p.m. on April 23rd, so later that day. So you can find us at Think5able on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And now we have a TikTok account, which is great, so you can find us there. Okay, so in this stream, we're going to be talking about some Unit 7 topics. And yes, I know that Unit 7 is not on the exam for this year, but it is extremely important that you know the content, especially if you're planning on taking an AP social science course in the future, such as AP economics, like microeconomics, macroeconomics, government, US history, world history. All of these ideas kind of like relate to that. And I find that Unit 7, even though it was cut off the AP exam, it's probably the most relatable topic to like the real world. So anything you see in the news, anything in the real world, this is the unit that you can make the most connections with. So I think that these topics are extremely useful, even if they're not being tested. And you can also practice your FRQ skills with these topics, not just the topics that you're going to be tested on. So in this stream, we'll be covering the measures of economic development, the measures of social development, development theories, sustainable development, and development scenarios. I know I said development a lot, but it's kind of the main focus of the stream. So I'm just really quickly going to go over the changes to the AP exam. So your exam is on May 12th. The makeup date is June 1st. You have 2 FRQs, so one is 25 minutes long. So after you finish that, you have a 5-minute submittal period, and then you move on to question 2. You have 15 minutes for that, and then 5 minutes to submit again. And remember that once you're on question 2, you can't go back to question 1. And your first FRQ will give you 2 stimuli. So that basically means that it'll give you 2 maps, charts, graphs, data tables, pictures, anything. And the second question will only give you 1 stimulus. So expect at least one part on each of the FRQ to be related to analyzing those stimuli. So make sure you're like practicing looking at maps, looking at patterns in your textbook. Like just look at all those like graphs and tables, not just the text. Okay, so now this is the Brandt line, and it's still used today by geographers and economists alike. So what it does, it basically divides the wealthier developed North from the lesser developed South. So the North consists of like North America, Australia, and Europe, and the South consists of South America, Africa, and South Asia. So the Brandt line is like a really good like visualization of just general economic patterns across the globe. So these are the most commonly used measures of economic development, and you've probably heard of them before. So they're GDP, GNP, and GNI. So GDP is gross domestic product, and it measures the value of all the goods and services produced within a certain country. So as long as it's within the borders, it's counted under the GDP. So let's say a French businessman comes and opens up a bakery in America. His bread is produced and sold in America, so it's counted under the GDP. Now, the GNP, which is the gross national product, it measures the value of all the goods and services produced by a certain country's residents and businesses, whether they're located in a different country or not. So, if an American businessman went and opened a bakery in France, well, that would be considered part of the GNP because he's an American, so he's producing stuff even though it's in another country, it's considered under the GNP. So the main difference between GDP and GNP is that GDP is based on like what's being made inside the borders, and GNP is based on what's being produced by the certain people of a nation. And GNI, which is the last one, is gross national income. So it's basically just GDP plus any money coming into the country via foreign investments, any kind of foreign income that's coming in, and then it minus any money that's going out, excuse me. So any remittances, I believe that was covered in unit 1, 2, or 3, and that's basically when people are working in America, but they're sending money back to the people in their home country. So they moved here for work, but they're sending money back. So the GNI is just GDP plus any money coming in minus any money going out. So there's some challenges with measuring economic development. So the main one is obviously every country has like different currencies. So the obvious way to tackle that, just convert all amounts to one currency. So if we're looking at the US economy in perspective of like in comparison to all the other economies of the world, we just convert everything to the US dollar. Easy. And then next is the value of currency changes over time. So what you do, you convert the amount to what they were originally worth in a given year. So this is known as finding the real value. You don't really need to know that, but it's just something that's good to know. So I don't know, if something is worth $3 in 2020, but you're looking at 2010's values, you would convert everything to what it was worth in 2010, which might be $1. And lastly, prices vary from country to country. So a TV might be worth $1,000 in the United States, but in the same TV in Switzerland might be only worth $600. So to tackle that problem, you use something called purchasing power parity, which is a really long term, but it basically just shows what a certain amount of money can buy in a country compared to other countries. So per capita measurements, and per capita just means per person. So it measures how much is made per person. So you basically take whatever you got for the GDP, GNP, or GNI, and then you divide that by the amount of people that live in the country or the population. So the per capita measurements are a much better representation of economic development because it shows how much income people are actually getting. So it shows their quality of life. So GDP could be, I don't know, $1 billion, but if there's 1 billion people living in that country, in a perfect equality situation, everyone would be only making $1. So that's not a very good quality of life. But on the other hand, if the GDP was $1 billion and there were only 10 people living in the country, well, everyone would be making $100 million. Of course, in a perfect equality situation, but that would still be a lot better quality of life than in the previous situation. So I have an easy example on the board, on the slide, I'm sorry. Country A has a gross domestic product of $100 million for the year 2019. In 2019, it had a population of 20,000 people. What is their GDP per capita? So what you do is you divide the GDP by the population. So if you know the answer, just put it in the chat. Okay, so the answer would be $5,000 because 100 million divided by 20,000 would be $5,000. So that would be their GDP per capita. So there's some more measures of economic development. So this is based on the sectoral structure of the economy. So there's two main parts of the economy. There's the formal sector and the informal sector. So the formal sector includes all the activities that are taxed and monitored by the government, and the informal sector has all the activities that aren't. So it's like all the under the table things. So, and I see we have a question. This is going to be on the test. No, Soleil, it's not. We're just making these streams so you have more context for any future social science classes, or if you want to look back on it. And this stuff relates to the real world like a lot more than the other units, so it's useful to stick around. Thank you for asking that question. Okay, so the activities of the informal economy are not included in the country's gross domestic product or gross national product, but anything in the formal economy is. So obviously in a developed country, you can see that a formal economy is going to be a lot more prevalent than an informal economy, while in a developing country, you're going to have a large informal sector. So there's some more measures of economic development. So this is income distribution, and this graph on the left is called the Lorenz curve. You don't need to know it for AP Human in general, but it basically just shows how much income inequality there is. And it gives you this value called the Gini coefficient. And that's just a measure of from 0 to 1, 0 being perfect income equality, and 1 being income inequality, like the max income inequality you can have. So on the map on the right, you can see that more developed countries, especially those in Western Europe, they tend to have like very small income inequality, but the United States kind of has a little more than usual. But in general, developing has more income inequality, and then developed less income inequality. So these are some measures of social development. So this relates to like standard of life, all that fun stuff. So these are some terms that you learned in Unit 2, which actually applied here. And these are like different population patterns and measurements. So these come into play with measuring development as well. The first one is fertility rates. So there's higher fertility rates in developing countries, lower fertility rates in developed countries. Birth rates and death rates kind of go together. This relates back to the DTM, demographic transition model. Higher birth rates, higher death rates is correlated with developing countries, and lower death rates, lower birth rates, developed countries. And child mortality rates and infant mortality rates, the higher those are, the more developing they are, and vice versa. Because developed countries have more healthcare, more access to medical care, like just overall like higher income, so they have more to spend on just like sending people to the doctor. And literacy rates. So developed countries have higher literacy rates because they have a lot more education, and they have like more ways to regulate how like children go to school. And access to healthcare is obviously there's more access in developed countries. Gender inequality, we will talk about that later, but there's less gender inequality in developed countries. Caloric intake is lower in countries that are developing because they don't have the same access to food, so they don't get the same nutrients and they don't get like a wholesome meal. So that goes back to like those really high death rates and mortality rates because they don't have that nutrition to keep them like sustained. And life expectancy is lower in developing countries and higher in developed countries. So the last measure of social development, I just wanted you guys to like look at this like graph, but it just shows that developed countries consume a lot more energy and resources than developing countries. So basically all countries in the world heavily rely on fossil fuels, but developed countries, they use renewable energy sources. So they have more money to implement all these infrastructure like solar power, windmills, like the aqua, I don't know, the things that produce hydroelectric power. Sorry, I forgot the name. Dams, right? And so they have all this money to spend on infrastructure while developing countries are more focused on kind of boosting their economy and getting to a higher stage because that's their main priority before focusing on renewable energy sources. So the gender gap. The gender gap is differences in the privileges of males and females. So this can include differences in like education, wages, voting rights, healthcare, government involvement, property rights, making contraception decisions, inheriting property, or even driving a car. So I believe in 2016, women just got the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. So that's like one big example of the gender gap. So the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII, which is shown on the map, it takes into account reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation. So those are the three factors that go into it. So to determine reproductive health, they look at maternal mortality rates, so the rates of how many mothers die per every 10,000 childbirths, I believe, and then they look at adolescent fertility rates. And for empowerment, they look for what percent of government seats are held by each gender. So if more females hold more government seats in the government, empowerment is greater. And then they also look at how many females get a secondary education, so that can also be a factor in empowerment. And then labor market participation just looks at how many females are part of the labor force after they're 15 or older. And this composite score measures how much potential human development is lost to the gender gap. So you can see these dark blue countries on the map. They're losing from 50 to 70% of their potential because of the differences between males and females. While the countries that are like the light green shade, they're only losing from like 10 to 25% because of the gender gap. And in recent decades, women have been encountering increased employment opportunities and just like better situations in general. Like gender inequality is like kind of decreasing slowly, even though it still exists. So NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, what they're doing is that they're helping women find jobs outside of the home, and also transnational corporations, which are these huge companies that span across multiple countries. They open factories in developing countries where all these women are less advantaged than their male counterparts, and they often hire women because they would work for lower wages and have more availability than men. But this still allows women to start making their own money and start becoming more independent and self-sustainable, and it's a step in the right direction. And also NGOs are allowing women to have more educational opportunities, especially in the past 20 years. And with more education, you're more prepared to work, and you get paid more when you have more educational expertise. So as we can see from the last slide, women have like a huge role in economic development. So as women's roles grow, economic development also grows coincidentally. So the roles of women change as countries develop economically. So they can go from staying at home to getting simple factory jobs to having managerial and upper level positions in a company, jobs in STEM, research, development, and all of that like really high end stuff. So although there are more women in the workforce than before, they still don't have that equity in wages and employment opportunities, and they can face a lot of employment discrimination, especially when it comes to upper level jobs like CEOs, managers, and all of that stuff. So that like gap between males and females still exists today, but it's slowly decreasing, and it'll get there. And NGOs have also started microcredit and microfinance programs in developing countries. And what they do, they provide microloans, like small amounts of money to women and other poorer people who don't have the money to create and expand their own small businesses. So once they become entrepreneurs, they start just like becoming a lot more independent and successful. And without these organizations, women wouldn't qualify for credit and loans because they wouldn't be making their own money. So they don't have a credit score, they don't have any bank history, so they can't get loans. But when they do get loans, they can start and expand and just start making things, creating businesses. And what happens as a result of that is that women are more influential in their own households and in their communities. So they get a greater say in childbearing decisions, they can pay for their own contraceptives, and they can afford more healthcare and more foods for their kids. So those mortality rates go down because they can start paying for like more nutritional meals, and then they can pay for doctor's visits. And when they work, they also have less time for children, which decreases that birth rate, which goes along with the DTM, the demographic transition model. So once you have those lower birth rates, you start having more development. And overall, they can like just depend less on the men of the household if they start making their own money. Okay, so human development is the Human Development Index, or HDI, is a composite measure developed by the United Nations, which is used to show spatial variation among states regarding levels of development. So the HDI, just like the Gini coefficient that we talked about before, it has a score between 0 and 1, with 1 being the most developed countries, and then 0 being like completely undeveloped. So the Human Development Index is great for showing the negative impacts of extreme poverty on developing countries' economic potential. So you can see on this map that this like little graphic thing that the Human Development Index has like 4 main factors. It has other like factors that go into it as well, but the 4 main ones are GDP per capita or income, life expectancy, education level, and adult literacy rate. And because this is not going to be on the AP exam. This is mainly for just like learning about stuff in the real world, because this economics content like goes back into like the news, modern day stuff. Okay, so we'll move on to the theories of development. So these are Rostow stages of economic growth. So economist Walt Rostow created this model to show the shift from traditional to modern day society. So it was kind of similar to the DTM, but it focuses more on economic development and modernization rather than population growth. So Rostow assumed that economic development was like a linear growth, and all countries wanted to eventually become modernized, and they did so at different speeds. So the first stage is called traditional society, and this is characterized by primary sector activities like farming, hunting, and fishing. They don't use that much technology, and any trade that they have is very local or regional. There's no international trade, and they're not socioeconomically progressive, so they don't focus on gender rights, working rights, none of that stuff. And only small regions of the world are in this stage as of now, because there's no whole countries in this stage, obviously, because everyone's some level of developed now. But some examples would be like medieval Europe or like the original English colonies of the 1700s. And the second stage is called precondition for takeoff. And this is where there is more infrastructure, like electric lines, roads, water lines, all of that stuff starts like falling into place. There's better farming techniques, and then you move from subsistence to commercial agriculture, and international trade starts in this stage. So they start exporting raw materials and crops. They obviously can't export goods like finished products yet because they don't have any industry yet, but they're starting to use their natural resources and start trading with that. And in this stage, technology starts spreading, not necessarily like smartphones and all of that stuff, but just like water wheels, boats, all of that stuff. And they start becoming socioeconomically progressive. So some countries in this stage are Nigeria and Afghanistan as of today, and this was where the United States was in the early 1800s. So the third stage is called takeoff, and this is where major tech innovations happen. Industrialization really begins to kick off. The primary sector, so that farming, fishing, all the extraction of natural resources, that sector becomes smaller, and entrepreneurialism starts, so people start creating businesses, and urbanization starts, so cities start forming, and overall, they just become more self-sustainable as a society. So as of today, Bangladesh is in this stage, and this is where the United States was in the when it was like the mid 1800s. And the fourth stage is called the drive to maturity. So in this stage, new industries start up and old industries become even better. So new things start, like more technologically based industries start, and then like old things that like dealt with processing natural resources, they become even more efficient. And there's better infrastructure relating to like energy, communication, and transportation. So living conditions just become better with that. And then there's a lot of economic growth in this stage. there's more social infrastructure. So that goes back to the social development that we talked about with like the fertility rates, mortality rates, access to education. So they start building schools, hospitals, and just things that improve living conditions. So this stage right now, Brazil is in this stage, and then in the late 1800s, the United States was in this stage. And the last and final stage of Rostow's model is called high mass consumption. So this is when consumerism sets in. So people start spending money on non-essential goods like and luxury goods that they don't really need, but it's just like a nice thing to have. So that's consumerism. And in this stage, they also have a really strong tertiary sector. So Harrison will be doing a stream in the future about the economic sectors. So you don't need to focus on what that is right now, but it's just a strong tertiary sector. And people start moving towards an egalitarian society. So now that everything is like developed, there's like cities, industry, infrastructure, there's all of that great stuff. But now they start focusing on like fairness and like social equality because they have more time to and money to spend towards that. And this is where Japan and the United States are today. So there's criticisms of Rostow's model, just like any other model. So the main one is that it was very like limited in its perspective, and it was based on only American and European countries. So it didn't really accurately reflect other cultures and other economies. Next, it was based on a strictly linear progression, so only going like up in like a constant way. But it didn't take into account that the fact that some countries just can't develop that easily unless they get like a lot of help from like other countries. And some countries even go backwards. They don't necessarily go forward through these stages. And this model also says that every country can develop. And this isn't true because not every country has the resources, the size, the proper government to move forward. And this model also encourages the less developed countries to be exploited and depended on for natural resources. And lastly, it doesn't consider that it's the carrying capacity of the globe because it's really hard to sustainably make all countries reach high mass consumption because once everyone is at that really like consumerism based stage, we're going to run out of resources, and this model just doesn't take that into account. So this is Wallerstein's world systems theory. It's another theory about just like socioeconomic development, but it was developed by Immanuel Wallerstein, and he made this theory based on the idea that all countries are connected and they depend on each other to succeed. So it's an example of a dependency theory. So people depend on each other, countries depend on each other to survive. And Wallerstein divided the world's nation into three categories, and he said that the world system will always have a combination of the three types of countries. So it was more accurate in that sense than Rostow's model, which said that all countries would eventually reach high mass consumption. But Wallerstein admitted that like there would be periphery countries, there would be semi-periphery countries, there would be world core countries, excuse me. So core countries would be the ones with really high economic development. So they would be the center of global businesses. They would be home to multinational headquarters, high skill production, capital accumulation, and they just overall they dominate over the semi-periphery and periphery countries because they give them low wages and they take advantage of their weak economic environmental laws and they get a lot out of international trade. So the core countries today, they mainly rose to dominance by like initially being the hubs of industry. So the Industrial Revolution in like America and Europe. So they were like the hubs of where industry started. So as that industry grew, obviously economy grew with it. And with that expansion of money, they have political power that also grows. And they exerted that power through colonialism. So they started taking over other regions around them. And now that all of colonized countries are independent, core countries still have a lot of influence over the semi-periphery and periphery countries, which used to be colonized. And they do this by controlling the production of goods in those countries. And This economic and cultural influence that still exists today, even post-colonialism, is called neocolonialism. So that's a term that might appear somewhere. And private corporations and multinational companies have obviously contributed to this influence. Like we talked about before, the transnationals, they move their factories and everything to those developing countries, and then they start using them for like their low wages and weak economic environmental laws. And some countries that are in this part of the world system are the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, Germany, and Switzerland. So the semi-periphery countries are kind of like the middle income nations. They're like average. They get resources from the periphery countries, and then they produce goods and services for the core countries. So some examples would be like Mexico and the BRICS countries. So BRICS. So this stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So these are semi-periphery countries that are growing rapidly in terms of their economy. So they have a lot of influence and they compete directly with the core countries. So they may be semi-periphery, but they're just as strong. And lastly, the periphery countries are the least developed nations. They have a lot of low skill, labor intensive industry there. They focus on extraction of raw materials, and they provide the core and the semi periphery with their cheap materials, labor, and crops. And they don't really profit much from manufacturing as compared to the other two types of countries, and they have very weak workers' rights and environmental laws. So some examples would be Peru, Kenya, Cambodia, Zimbabwe, and Mali. So there was some criticisms of the world systems theory. So first, it doesn't consider culture, just like Rostow's model, and it focuses on economic influence too much, and it doesn't like take into account like social media and like pop culture and all of that stuff. And it's very outdated. So it was based on industrial production of like the 1900s, 1800s, but now countries are post-industrial, so they're in the tertiary, quaternary, quaternary sections of the economy. They're all like research and development based. So it's not very useful anymore, but it's still a very like influential model in AP Human because the words core, semi-periphery, and periphery will be used all over to describe countries. And lastly, it doesn't show how countries can improve their status. So it doesn't give any instruction on how a country can move from semi-periphery to core or like periphery to semi-periphery. So these are the UN Millennium Development Goals. So these 8 goals kind of focus on how like the world can progress as a whole. And they were mainly made to improve the lives of those living in underdeveloped countries. So the first one is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. The second one is to achieve universal primary education. The third one is to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women. The fourth one is to reduce child mortality. Fifth is to improve maternal health. Sixth is to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Seventh is to ensure environmental sustainability. And eighth is to develop a global partnership for development. So these goals have been very successful so far, but obviously some challenges remain with getting countries up to speed. And goals 3 and 5 go back to the women empowerment and development that we previously discussed. But these MDGs are like very important to just like developing the world as a whole. So sustainable development, it's really important as people consume more and more, and like the population density is just on the rise. It just continues to increase. And it's extremely important that we focus on sustainability so that future generations can live nicely. And this goes back to the development goal number 7, which called for environmental sustainability. So first, resources are being depleted. So this can be resisted with efficient farming methods, trying not to drain soil of its nutrients and like keep soil fertile, and by minimizing food wastage. Next, the environment is being degraded. So warmer climates are making diseases spread faster and faster, and with rising ocean levels, people can be forced to move inland, and that further increases population density because those coastlines will become like non-existent. They'll just be like eaten by the ocean, and then everyone moves inland, and then everyone just becomes tighter and tighter, and then more population density, which is even worse for the environment. So it's kind of just like a domino effect, and that's not good. And also, extreme storms and droughts can result from the climate change that's happening right now, and this can cause loss of even more resources and even more human life. But this can be resisted by efforts to reduce air and water pollution, reducing waste by composting and recycling, and trying to minimize and completely stop climate change. And lastly, ecotourism is working on like fighting against these environmental changes. So ecotourism is basically just tourism that attempts to protect local ecosystems and educate visitors about the local ecosystem. So an example of this would be in Costa Rica. So they have local tours. So tour guides will take you around, and you're highly encouraged to like donate to protect the ecosystem that you just took a tour of. And you're also taught about the local wildlife. So you're more likely to have more passion for the environment and start like trying to protect it as much as you can. This table is from the AMSCO Human Geography textbook. So I found it really useful as like a summary of just everything, all the levels of development that we talked about. So I'll just go through it real quick. So for economic level, based on the GDP, the low end of development would be low income, middle income, and then high income. The economic development would be described as from low to high, it would be a less economically developed country, or an LEDC. Second would be emerging or developing countries, and then high end would be more economically developed countries, or MEDC. And the level of industrialization, so this is just like the amount of industry that's in that country. So a low end country would be non-industrialized, a middle range country would be newly industrialized, or an NIC, and then a high end country would be post-industrial, so more of that research and development. For Human Development Index, or the HDI, it would go low, medium, high, and very high. So that's just the spectrum. And then World Systems Theory, it would go from periphery to semi-periphery to core. And then in Rostow stages, it would be stages 1 and 2 for the low end of development, stage 3 for the middle range of development, and stage 4 and 5 for high end development. So this is a development scenario. So a country has many natural resources and is known for its strong primary economy. It has recently paved roads and installed power lines. Its GDP per capita is $115. So what stage of Rostow's model is this country likely in? In what part of Wallerstein's theory is this country likely in? Is this country's Human Development Index low, medium, or high? And does this country have gender inequality? So if you have any kind of like answers or ideas of what the answers are, just put them in the chat and we'll go over them. Okay, so I'll just go over the answers then. So this country is likely in stage 2 of Rostow's model because it said that it recently paved roads and installed power lines. So that means it's just starting to get infrastructure. But it also says that it's known for its primary economy. So that means that it's still not very developed. And it's a periphery country because, again, with that strong primary sector, it's known for extracting natural resources and using that. And it has a low GDP per capita. So that would lead to a low human development index. And yes, this country has high gender inequality because it is less developed, as we concluded from the previous questions. So the next scenario, and this is the final one, this map shows gender inequality across the whole world, which best describes the countries that are colored with dark red. A, semi-periphery countries, B, more economically developed countries, C, stage 4 in Rostow's model, D, periphery countries, or E, post-industrial countries. So if you have an idea of what the answer should be, just put it in the chat, just the letter. Okay, so the answer is D, periphery countries, because the super dark countries are, as you can see on the map, are located in Africa and South Asia. So you can see that those are still developing. So those would be your periphery countries. Thank you so much for attending today's stream. And remember, you can find us at Think Flyvable on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and now on TikTok. So if you have any questions about the structure of the exam or just the content that we covered today, just put them in the chat box or in the Ask a Question feature below, and I can answer them. Okay, so I don't see any questions, but thank you so much for attending. Have a great day. Bye.